Order. We now move to the next debate, and I call Mr. Jim Fitzpatrick to move the motion. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Mr. Owen, I beg to move that the House has considered leaseholders and housing association ballots, sir. It's a pleasure to see you presiding over this debate this morning. I'm also very pleased to see the Minister taking his place. This is an ongoing and continuing constructive dialogue that I and others have been having with the Minister on these matters, or at least on part of these matters, which will become clear in due course. I should point out, Mr. Owen, that the title of this may be slightly misleading, as I intend to cover leasehold reform as a separate but connected matter to Housing Association ballots, but I have advised the Minister's office of this, and I'm sure he is forewarned of the shape that this contribution will take. I raised these items in the last dying days of the previous Parliament on March the 6th and welcome the opportunity to put them on the ministerial radar early in this session. Although I say I'm raising them, as I've mentioned, I know the Minister is already more than aware, certainly on the leaseholder issues. Indeed, I should put on record that I and others are grateful to the Minister and his officials for arranging a meeting on the 8th of June on leaseholder matters with the Honourable Member for Worthing West, myself, and representatives of LKP, the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. The Honourable Member for Worthing West has led on these issues for some considerable time, and I'm pleased to be assisting his significant efforts. Mr. Martin Boyd and Mr. Sebastian O'Kelly have campaigned as LKP and have made much progress in engaging with government, in securing charitable status, and generally ensuring that millions of leaseholders have a voice and an organisation dedicated to advising and assisting them. I don't want to labour this item, Mr. Owen, as the Minister, I know, has his officials examining many of the anomalies and weaknesses identified, from our perspective at least, in existing legislation covering leaseholders, including matters such as problems with retirement homes, the main issue of common hold versus leasehold as property ownership, tribunal procedures, which are supposed to be relatively informal, but can get very expensive when the defending freeholder brings high-powered barristers against local residents who are trying to get redress for problems that they've identified, unscrupulous freeholders and predatory property management companies. I know the industry, the sector, is doing a lot to improve its image and to improve the professionalism of property management services. But there have been some predatory organisations out there preying on vulnerable people and taking a lot of money unfairly. And two other issues, one forfeiture, which we discussed a bit in depth with the Minister last time, and recognition issues and the difficulty in leaseholders being able to get their association recognised by some property management companies of freeholders because of the difficulties in securing numbers, identifying owners of properties and the like. And finally, we have also raised with them the different roles and responsibilities of the Department for Communities and Local Government and the Ministry of Justice, and the fact that this is a policy area which has implications for both departments and questions of how well those arrangements are working. And I know the Minister is well aware of all of these issues, which were reinforced from our last meeting, and I acknowledge that he has tasked his officials to examine them and to report back. And we look forward to progressing discussions on these in due course. If, however, the Minister has anything new he wishes to add, his comments obviously would be very welcome by all who are taking an interest in leaseholding, but I fully accept that his officials are doing a lot of work on this, and our recent meeting probably means that there's not a lot to report back. But in conclusion on this, Mr Owen, the Honourable Member for Worthing West, ably assisted by Ms Catherine O'Riordan, have organised another round-table discussion on leaseholding and leasehold reform on July the 9th, which I know the Minister and his officials have been invited, and they would be very welcome. These have been very successful fora which have been taking place in recent years and furnish a lot of information and experience on these issues. Moving on, if I may, to housing association ballots, Mr Owen. The Minister may be less informed of the concerns I raised on March the 6th, because that debate was responded to by the Deputy Leader of the House, whom I'm sure would have reported back, and I fully accept that the Minister's officials would have read the Hansard and been aware of the questions that I was raising. As the Honourable Gentleman knows, hundreds of thousands of tenants in recent decades voted in stock transfer ballots to leave local authority control, i.e. to move from council housing, and have their properties managed instead by housing associations. Thousands, probably tens of thousands of my constituents were among those who agreed to do this. The driver, very simply put, was that housing associations could modernise and refurbish run-down council properties and raise them back above the decency threshold as homes, because they could raise the finance when the rules prevented councils and council housing organisations from doing the same. This meant a combination of new kitchens, bathrooms, windows, central heating, security and such like. Many of these schemes were very successful, and I have a number in my constituency. However, not all were. And also there were a number of issues which arose, some ongoing, such as the quality of work and the materials that were used, charges for the work or overcharging, transparency. I noticed recently that there were two very contradictory reports on some schemes. The Evening Standard reported bribery and corruption at housing organisation in Hackney, whereas Inside Housing reported a very positive contract, one in Brighton, creating hundreds of apprentices and new jobs, for example. So there are different experiences of different schemes in different parts of the country. But there are a number of other issues which were also raised. Costs and service charges, and finally the appeals procedures. Many tenants were able to resolve these issues with the assistance of their registered social landlord, and government changed the regulations to level the playing field in terms of transparency and accounting and information, but not all concerns were addressed. In a few cases, the offer promised by some housing associations to entice council tenants to vote for the stock transfer ballot were never fulfilled. In these cases, tenants were powerless to have their complaints resolved, because having voted to hand over their property to new landlords, there was and is no mechanism to vote to sack that housing association for poor performance. Now, such a sanction exists for the regulators, i.e. if the Homes and Communities Agency, the Housing Ombudsman, following complaints of failures, can order mergers and takeovers of failing housing associations, but residents are powerless. Incidentally, leaseholders who exercise right to buy or previous council property are quite powerless and even voiceless, as they have no vote in the transfer of whole estates where they lived, unless local housing associations included them in the consultative arrangements, and good RSLs did do this at the time. The government has introduced a cap on charges now, which is very welcome, and I acknowledge that as a very positive change. But my main question to the Minister is on the rights of housing associations and whether they can or should be empowered to sack poorly performing housing associations. In the private sector, leaseholders, as I mentioned earlier, despite the anomalies in the recognition procedure, are entitled to ballots if their property management company lets them down, and to vote to award their contract to a new company. So if it's good enough for the private sector, my question is, why can't it work in the public sector? It would appear to be an essential element of consumer protection that if an individual or individuals are disappointed with any purchase, that a customer can ask for redress, they can return goods, they can seek compensation, and they can purchase alternative products elsewhere. But not, apparently, if you live in a housing association property. I was going to say social housing, but of course council tenants can switch initially by stock transfer ballot that I mentioned, so they have an initial choice, but then they're locked in, and having transferred, they have no further rights. Now, the Minister obviously will be publishing his housing bill in this session. I'm not sure when he might be able to indicate timing, even generally. And just as an aside, but an important aside for many of us, there are real concerns about aspects of the bill which have been raised publicly, such as the sale of housing association properties under the proposals from the government and the economics of whether like-for-like will be replaced, which I know has been raised by a number of people. And the second anomaly for me, certainly in Tower Hamlets, is higher value council properties requiring to be sold. Both these elements will have a huge negative impact on Tower Hamlets, because being an inner London borough, all of our property is very expensive. But the 3, 4 and 5 bedroom properties, which are absolutely essential for the kind of community which we have, are very expensive properties. And if these go from the social housing stock, then that will create major difficulties for local people. But in conclusion, Mr Owen, and to go back to my main question about tenants getting control of their estates, may I ask the Minister if he would be prepared to look at an amendment to his bill to allow housing association tenants, and with all the appropriate safeguards that would be required, to vote to transfer the management of their properties from one housing association to another, or to return to ALMO or council housing control. This is a big issue for many thousands of my constituents, Mr Owen. It's one that, as I say, I have raised before. It has got quite a bit of interest, because this would be a brand new right for housing association tenants. Obviously, the government very clearly have housing associations in their sight for reform, and this is one reform that I'm very interested to hear if the Minister would be interested in that. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity this morning to have raised these matters, and I'm very much looking forward to the Minister's response.
I call the Minister to reply and welcome him back to his place.
Thank you, Mr Owen, and it's a pleasure to serve under your your chairmanship this morning at my first time back in Westminster Hall. I appreciate your comments. I also congratulate the Honourable Member for Poplar and Limehouse on securing this debate. I know both he and my Honourable friend, the member for Worthing West, work very, very hard to reflect their ongoing views and some of the issues they raise for leaseholders and tenants generally, and in the Honourable Member's case, obviously, particularly within for the residents of Tower Hamlets. And it's to both their credit, actually, that they continue to represent both their constituents' interests in this matter and the wider interests of people across the leaseholder foray. And I'm keen that we do find some common ground and a way forward. And I appreciate the chance to meet with them, as the Honourable Member said, just a couple of weeks ago. Now, I know that in particular the Honourable Member has obviously raised and looks to explore the possibility of a new power, as he outlined, that would allow tenants of an underperforming housing association to effectively sack their association. And I'll turn to my specific views on that in a few moments, but I would say that a solution to the concerns raised really we would like to see achieved within the current framework of powers, and I think that is achievable. It's of course important that tenants are protected and there are sufficient safeguards currently in place. The Localism Act of 2011 gave tenants and their representatives the power to hold landlords to account. It enabled recognised tenant panels to play an important role in resolving complaints at a local level, and it was an important step. As the Honourable Member outlined, some of the changes recently have taken a big step forward, and it's one that we feel was right. Landlord and tenant issues are often local issues. The range and seriousness of issues clearly can vary, and it's right, absolutely right, that tenants are offered a level of protection at the national level as well. But where possible, I am firmly of the view that the issues themselves should be sorted out locally using that framework that we are able to put in place. If it's clear that complaints cannot be resolved locally, then obviously they can be referred by tenants to the Housing Ombudsman. And where the Ombudsman themselves finds in favour of a complaint, they can order the landlord to pay compensation or take, as he's outlined, other steps to provide redress. And it is, of course, open to the Ombudsman or tenants to raise concerns directly with the regulator. We would not want tenants to jump directly to the Ombudsman. As I've said, our view is that vast majority of issues can and should be resolved locally. The agency, via its regulator function, does not have responsibility or power to mediate in or resolve individual cases, but will investigate where there is evidence of a breach of regulatory standards and, on landlord and tenant issues, serious harm. In extreme cases, it does have far-reaching powers to intervene where there is evidence of serious mismanagement. And I just want to outline, to be helpful, the kind of approaches that are being taken to give the House some examples by the regulator when issues are raised that they do judge to be serious. And I'm providing these to demonstrate how seriously the regulator takes its role in this area. For example, in February just this year, it was found that a provider broke consumer standards owing to the poor quality of emergency repairs for many tenants over a very long period. A regulatory notice was published, and it represented the first time that such a finding had been made for widespread service failure. In April, the case took a further step forward when it was found that the underlying cause of the emergency repairs issues was a failure of corporate governance. As a result, the provider in question is now focusing on addressing these issues, and rightly so. If non-compliance is not addressed, the regulator does have statutory duties to intervene formally, which could lead to interventions in the management structure of a particular provider. It's right also that the powers available to the regulator should only be used as a last resort. I'm providing the information to provide reassurance for the Honourable Member and others who may look at this in hindsight, that there is reassurance that where issues are serious, the regulator can and indeed will take appropriate action. Now, having outlined the current approach and the potential impact on housing associations, I just want to spend a moment outlining some of the wider options that are available to housing association tenants themselves as well. And while it would not be legally possible for tenants to be given the right to sack their housing association at the moment, they do have other routes to explore that would hand them a much greater degree of control. Where housing association leaseholders are in blocks of flats, they have the right to manage. This would enable a group of leaseholders to take over the management functions of their properties. And I know that the Honourable Member may draw a parallel here with his proposals to have the power to sack their association. And I'm sure one of the areas we might slightly disagree on is that my view is the power that is there in right to manage is enough, and the substantial difference, the important difference between the right to manage the properties is that under the right to manage the properties, they would still actually be owned, obviously, by the housing association, which is very different to the ability to manage them, obviously, and make sure that repairs are done properly. And therefore, I don't think it's possible to draw that complete comparison in the way he described in his outline earlier and indeed in previous debates. The leaseholders may also be able to buy the freehold of their blocks of flats, known as enfranchisement, subject to some criteria, and this would give them even greater financial and indeed legal interest. Now, of course, we've set out a very clear policy ambition, as the Honourable Member rightly outlined, to give housing association tenants the right to buy their homes, to match that social housing opportunity that exists in council housing at the moment, to make sure that everybody in social housing has the same rights to buy. And we will provide, and I will, as tempting as this morning is and his invitation is to outline the details of the bill, I'm sure he'll appreciate that I will ask him to, the entire Chamber to bear with me until we do publish the bill and outline the details behind that in due course. But I am hopeful that a number of housing association tenants will therefore, after that bill has seen royal assent, be able to take the opportunity to move into home ownership. And I will just touch on a couple of points he raised. He quite rightly raised the issue around, and I do understand, as members have raised in a recent opposition debate as well in the House just a couple of weeks ago, around how the policy will implement. I'll be very clear, as we have said all along, there must be one-for-one replacement. And I'm very pleased that the reinvigorated scheme has one-for-one replacement. And we are seeing those numbers move from where they were, and I'm sure he'll excuse me highlighting this, but under the last Labour government, where the numbers were 1 in 170, the reinvigorated scheme is one-for-one. And councils have that 3 years to provide that replacement. And at the end of that 3 years, if they haven't done it, although my indications at the moment, I have confidence that they will meet those figures, then that money with interest comes back to the HCA, who will provide those homes. There will be one-for-one. And I must stress that our view is that giving that new power would allow tenants of an underperforming housing association, the ability, as he outlines it, to sack their housing association, is therefore, with the framework that's already there, plus what we are looking at the housing bill, it could be unnecessary, unworkable, and that a solution for the concerns raised must be achieved within the framework that is there at the moment. I appreciate his comments around tempting me to accept an early, and I would say early in inverted commas, amendment to the bill we haven't published yet, but I'm sure we'll have that discussion later in the year when the bill comes forward, and obviously we'll look at, and I'll happily liaise with him and my officials will around what he's looking at, but I suspect we may be in a slightly different place, as I've already outlined, as tempting as his early pitch at amendment is. I think that's probably the first one that I've had so far. I hope this has been a useful outline. I appreciate, as I say, I congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for bringing this issue so early in this Parliament to make sure that the concerns and the thoughts of leaseholders are aired at an early opportunity. And as I said before, I'm very keen to ensure that tenants do know how to resolve their local concerns. They fully understand and appreciate the powers and the opportunities that they do have. And although I have to make clear, as he will, I know, that I cannot intervene on these matters personally, I would recommend that the honourable member and residents who are involved in these situations do write directly to the regulator if they feel that any of the regulatory standards are, unfortunately, being broken. Thank you.
I'm grateful to the Minister. Under these new procedures, there is an opportunity for the member to have a right to reply if he wishes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Owen. Very briefly, just to express appreciation to the Minister for the information he's given. I'm sure that we will look at that very closely. I know that my local authority, Tower Hamlets Council, are very engaged in this process. I'm not sure if local councils have a role to play, but certainly because the affected tenants are residents within the borough, they have a moral obligation, if not a legal obligation, to engage. And I know that they are looking to speak directly to certain housing associations also. I hear what the Minister says about the bill. Obviously, we will look at a potential amendment in due course, and we will be grateful if he does give it some consideration at the appropriate time. As he says, we are having ongoing discussion. These will continue, and look forward to future meetings in due course.
Thank the member and put the question necessary that this House has considered leaseholders and housing association ballots. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.